The amount that the global garment industry contributes to global warming is shocking. It's something like 10% of all carbon emissions are created by the global garment industry. And effectively, they're telling people to buy new stuff that they don't need from very, very expensive brands, when trend is encouraging us to buy more for the sake of buying. It's massively problematic. These are cheap clothes that are not made of natural fibres. They just go into landfill. It's creating a massive global problem. I spent years just drinking. You go on trips and you'd be given endless champagne. You'd fly business class, you'd get champagne, you'd land, you'd go to a dinner, you'd get it was constant. I couldn't even see an idea of a life beyond it. There was no escaping it. And then I had a big crisis moment. So I went to an AA meeting. There was someone who wanted to be my sponsor there, and they were like, if you don't stop, you're going to be injecting yourself with meth in 2 years and drinking Guinness in the morning.
Hello and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Ollie Dugmore. My guest today has had his finger on the pulse of British men's fashion for over a decade. From the suburbs of Fetcham to the front row of London Fashion Week. He served as a style director for both British GQ and Esquire, interviewing designers, reviewing catwalk shows, and rubbing shoulders with the who's who of fashion is all in a day's work. He still found the time to style A-list celebrities and consult for designer labels. His new book, The Closet, is a coming-of-age story, told through 12 items of clothing that have shaped and draped his life. In doing so, he shares snapshots of his coming-out journey, his eccentric family, and his fraught relationship with his father and alcohol. My guest today is Teo van den Broeke. How's tricks, Teo?
Oh, good. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm very glad to have you here. It's quite intense, isn't it? Sort of sitting and listening, and I actually feel increasingly nervous. Maybe we should start doing the intros before people sit down, so that it's like slightly less stressful. But hearing your life sort of laid out before you,
totally,
can be quite strong.
Yeah, it's like the kind of this is your life moment.
Yes,
and you don't really remember doing any of the things that you're talking about either. It's like, did I?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Fortunately, you can refer back to the book to check out if these things did or did not happen.
Yeah.
Before we get into discussing all of that, how are you? What have you been up to? How does the world find you at the moment?
I'm good. I'm very busy at Soho House, where I'm editorial director these days. It's a big job. So that's taking up a lot of my time, but also doing a lot of book promo, which is very exciting. A little bit of a gear change.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting thing putting a book out into the world.
Really personal subject matter, and so I guess there's all in a way that perhaps, if it was fiction, you would perhaps. If there was any criticism, it'd still be personal. But when it pertains so directly to your life, it's very difficult to receive any kind of criticism, I guess, and not interpret that personally, and not interpret it because so much of it is who you are as a person, right, on the page.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, touch wood, I've been quite fortunate thus far that there hasn't been anything scathing, bar a few early comments from my family, which I'm sure we'll come to later. But yeah, there hasn't been, actually now you say that, there hasn't been anything kind of outwardly negative. I'm praying that there won't be, because you're right. I mean, it's a very febrile thing. It's like I've put out this little piece of my soul into the world. And when I was writing it, I didn't think about that really. It was almost like therapy. It was like, I just have to get this down. I have to do it, whether it's published or not. And by some quirk of fate, it was. And then it's like, oh God, it's actually out there, and you are exposed. And, my best friend Lauren, who's written about extensively in the book, she's one of the main characters, she said to me throughout the process, she was very careful to say, Tay, it's amazing, but you have to be prepared. There will be people who won't like it. There'll be homophobes who are anti it. There'll be people who just think it's a bit rubbish. And you have to be prepared that by taking an artistic leap, so to speak, you run that risk. And I kind of said, yeah, Lauren, yeah, sure. And I haven't listened to that at all. And the moment that someone says something negative, I'll probably crumble and have to stay in bed for 3 weeks. But currently it's okay.
I wonder as well if, going from being the journalist, the reviewer, the critic on occasion, and the shoe now being on the other foot, has it changed your perspective at all, perhaps, about some of the work you've done in the past? Or I guess, yeah, I'd be interested to hear the comparison between being the one who does the critiquing and then being the one who possibly receives it.
That's an interesting question, because I think, yeah, you have to be really, really careful when you're criticising work in a journalistic sense or in any sense, I think. And actually, I got into fashion journalism very young, and there was this kind of cult around the idea of being mean about work, and that somehow made you better at criticism. If you could find the most scathing way possible to say something negative about a collection or, you know, a shoe, you were then somehow venerated. And actually, there's a real responsibility. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think fashion criticism has gone a certain way for many reasons, because of social media or whatever. Like, people just don't read as much fashion criticism as they used to, and they make their own minds up. But I think, you know, if you are in a position of power and you have a standpoint from which you could decimate someone, you have to think very, very hard before you do it, because ultimately, you know, that is a piece of their life that they've put together. You know, whether it's a collection that's taken them 6 months to produce and then, you know, 5 minutes to show, or a book that's taken a year and a half to write. You know, it's all about context. And so much of criticism is really what you're saying is, I didn't like the timing of this thing, because everything's relevant at some point.
Yeah.
Everything has its moment, and sometimes just things are released at the wrong time. And yeah, sometimes things are rubbish. I don't really know what I'm saying there, but
I understand what you're saying.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
sometimes
completely.
things are just objectively not very good. But
And that
to
still
some,
has to be said, right?
And it has to be said, but to some people it is going to be good. And I just think what I'm trying to say is that you have a real responsibility when you are taking on the role of a critic.
Teo, before we get into the meat of this, our producer Laura, one of the first questions she's written on my sheet here is to ask you for a bit of advice for me about how I've styled myself today. I was in two minds about asking this question, because I feel like I'm, particularly in the light of the conversation we've just had, actually, about sometimes you do have to be a stern critic.
It was a clever way of preempting this question. I
Exactly.
think.
I thought about it. And actually, as well, there are audio listeners only. It's not all video. So, as you critique, if you wouldn't mind critiquing how I'm dressed today, if you could also be descriptive about what I'm wearing for the people that are listening, I'd be very grateful.
Sure. So Ollie is wearing a sage green corduroy, jumbo corduroy shirt with a white t-shirt tucked into some faded indigo slim cut jeans with some black leather hiking boots, I guess. They're like Red Wing kind of boots.
They are Red Wings, yeah.
On white Vibram soles. I would say, partly because you're wearing a similar top to me, I'm wearing a teal corduroy jacket. We're quite complementary of each other, so I'm into the cord. It's very seasonal appropriate.
Thank you.
You know, you've gone into the autumn vibes. It's layered in a way that allows you to take it off if it gets too warm, which it could at this time of year.
Absolutely.
The colouring is very good on you as well, because you've got a kind of sandy complexion, and the sage is very, very good against the colour of your hair. So points for that. I think your trousers are great. Lengthwise, they're just about right. They could maybe be rolled up so that they kind of kiss the top of the boot.
Oh, I like
just
that.
to give it a little bit of a personalisation.
Style it up, yeah.
You know, style it up slightly. The boots are good. They're quite worn in. You could probably do with a new Vibram sole on those.
I think I probably could.
But generally, I'd say you're a good 7.5 out of 10.
Unreal. Should we just finish there? That's not how I was expecting that to go, to be quite honest with you. Thank you so much. God, that's very kind. I was smiling.
Oh, good.
I had a beam on my face there. Disregarding the very nice things you've said about me. What brands, trends should I be wearing right now? Where are we at the moment in terms of men's fashion? What's in?
I'm a bit nervous of trend.
Okay, yeah.
I've you know, I think I spent a long time in my career. You know, the biggest job that I had to do each season at GQ was having gone to the shows, then distill down everything I'd seen into these big trend reports. And effectively, they're telling people to buy new stuff that they don't need from very, very expensive brands. Trend is fun. It's great. It's silly. Like, I love the idea of buying something new because it's just for the sake of it, because it looks like this kind of great confection that you want to kind of be embraced by for that moment. But when trend is encouraging us to buy more for the sake of buying in a kind of ecologically challenged world, I have a little bit of a concern about that. Which isn't to say that there aren't like movements that you can buy into that feel somehow not problematic in that sense. So things like, what did I write? I wrote a column about this recently. I need to try and remember what it was. Oh, okay. So cardigans, but specifically button-up kind of nana cardigans. So they're high collar, and they're crew neck, and the buttons go all the way down the front in kind of pastel shades. Prada showed a lot of those. Our Legacy had a couple, as did Gracewell's Bonner, and they're great as a kind of layering item. You may already have one in your wardrobe, or your girlfriend might, or your mum, or your grandma, actually, for that matter. So you could go shopping in their wardrobe, and then you're not buying anything new. I would also say that, what's another good trend to be getting in on? Boucle.
Oh, yeah?
So Boucle's been big in furniture for a little while now. You've probably seen it everywhere, so much so that it's all over HomeSense at the moment. Like, it's kind of reached its end in furniture. And Boucle basically means like looped wool. So it's that very loop fabric that Chanel used in all of her early collections. And it's everywhere in menswear at the moment. So whether it's a Boucle jacket, like a little kind of collarless jacket that they showed at Dior, or a Boucle suit, which is effectively tweed, Boucle is the fabric for winter.
Wonderful. Glad to hear it. This might be a bit tangential, but you got me thinking about this. Looking at kind of digital influencer economy and the kind of pursuit of, let's say I call it hauls, or, people buying huge amounts of clothing. And I'm quite conscious on a personal level. I haven't given this like a huge amount of thought, so I might be entirely wrong here, but it feels to me that there is a tension for fashion and I mean that in all aspects, not just high fashion. I mean, sort of more consumer, probably a little bit of fast fashion, and the sort of more accessible price end of things, and a world that is trying to be increasingly sustainable and is trying to move away perhaps from, a slightly more consumerist, more materialist mindset. It's quite broad, open-ended, but I just wondered maybe your thoughts on that. Like,
huge tension.
Okay.
There's huge tension, and it's massively problematic. The amount that the clothing, the global garment industry contributes to global warming is shocking. Like, it's something like 10% of all carbon emissions are created by the global garment industry. You'll need to check that, but it's huge. And our habits aren't changing. But we have a lot of unworn clothes, and we just buy for the sake of buying. And there is a huge problem with that, because invariably these are cheap clothes that are not made of natural fibers. So they're releasing microplastics when they're washed, and then when they're discarded, they just go into landfill, and it's creating a massive global problem. So we need to buy in a way that's more considered. We all need clothes, like, there's no question about that. But maybe it's buying less but better, and that's more satisfying too. And it's a difficult conversation also to have, because for a certain facet of the population, buying expensive clothes is not economically viable.
Totally.
And that's its own issue. But for those of us who have the privilege and the luxury of being able to choose how we spend our money in a kind of thoughtful way when it comes to garments, we need to be thinking more carefully and not buying for the sake of buying, and really buying seasonally because you need to buy for the weather, but not buying trend, dare I say, because that's where the problem lies. We feel we have to adhere to this constant movement and churn, which funds the whole industry and keeps it moving, but we don't. Ultimately, we don't.
I agree with you fully. So let's turn then to the subject matter of you. It's over your shoulder, but your wonderful book,
that old thing,
that old thing, The Closet.
Seen that cover far too many times.
Yeah, I'm sure, and probably a fair few signings, etc. as well. Let's talk about you and the journey that the book documents. And so, without wanting to seem too Freudian about it, we're going back to your childhood, and your sort of pubescent years, sort of particularly in relation to your sexual orientation. So, first of all, could you tell me a brief overview? What are your sort of formative memories about growing up? What are the first things you remember, and how they made you feel?
Well, one of the original memories I have that is charted in the first chapter of the book, in fact, and was where the kind of idea germinated from, was wanting this blue princess dress. So the first chapter is called The Blue Princess Dress, and I was desperate for this thing. It was part of my grandma's dressing up box at her house in Esquire in Surrey, and my cousins and I, there were 15 of us from 6 aunts, all of whom were very similar but also entirely different and kind of mad. And we'd be in that house every weekend, and every weekend we would open that dressing up box and interrogate its contents, and all come out wearing weird and wonderful things. And the blue princess dress was the one thing that everyone wanted to wear. I think the boys too, as much as the girls. And I knew that I loved it, and there was just something about it. It was the gauziness, it was the drama, it was the fabric, the little jewels that were on it that made the light shine on the ceiling in a way that, you know, just felt magical, and I was obsessed with it. And it wasn't just that dress, there were other dresses, and I felt excited by the idea of the kind of possibility of wearing those clothes. I don't know whether it was maybe slightly because they were illicit and they felt that they were naughty. I don't know, but there was just something really glamorous about it. And I, on my birthday, on my 6th birthday, which is when the book is set, I try to get this dress. My cousins get it before I do. There's a whole fight to get it. I get it, and then I'm shamefaced for wearing it by my male uncles, who I do not blame for this. I didn't know any better at the time, but you know, I remember that hot feeling of shame because I'd been wearing this dress. And it was like the first of many, for want of maybe a better term, microaggressions that I experienced as a young man, that told me what I wanted to do was not right and was somehow not societally acceptable. And whether that's wearing a dress or being into playing with Polly Pockets or not wanting to play football, which was a big thing. You know, my mum had to give me a thing of silly putty to play with on the sidelines because I didn't want to play football at school, and I hated it. And you know, there were so many, and that was seen as a problem. It was like, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to do that? Less so by my family, more so by, you know, my peers at school and teachers. And that built and built and built until, you know, I reached my early teenage years or my mid-teenage years and kind of came to the realization that I probably was gay. And I wore this kind of straight armor that I'd built in response to these microaggressions as a badge of honor. So I presented as quite masculine and big and, you know, and I didn't do any of those things anymore. And I still love the Spice Girls for a bit, but I didn't do any of those things that signified as being more feminine. And it took me until I started writing the book to realize how wrong that was and how damaging it was and how it kind of creates this split in who you are, because you're told throughout your life that what you are fundamentally is wrong. It's okay if you adapt and become what you should be, as long as you do it enough, but fundamentally you're wrong. And that realization was the moment where I knew I had to write the book.
I wouldn't know. I'm sure you probably weren't at 6 years old particularly conscious of a gender binary and trying to subvert it.
But I don't think I was until about 3 years ago, to be honest. But
I'm sort of hesitant to ask this, but I wonder do you think it was subversion for subversion's sake to cut a different path and not perhaps being able to put your finger on a why, but knowing that you wanted to do it, or and if it wasn't, at what point do you think you maybe sort of your consciousness about gender, sexual orientation, when did that start to change? When you start to become more aware of that?
It definitely wasn't subversion for subversion's sake. I was so young, you know, it was just an instinct. The thing is, of course I was attracted to the big blue gauzy cupcake dress. Like, who isn't?
Yeah.
You know, like the straight boys were too, of course. Like, why would you not be attracted to that? We're told we shouldn't be. So I kind of think of myself as quite brave for actually admitting to it when I was that age. But yeah, it was definitely not I wasn't being subversive for subversion's sake. In terms of my consciousness and my sexual orientation, that kind of raised when I was about 13 or 14.
Right.
And I think that I may be imagining this, but there was a moment where that Vogue 2000, October 2000 cover came out. My mum used to have this like little shelf in the upstairs toilet that had all the magazines on it. And this magazine had been relegated there, so it was probably Christmas 2000. And it was Robbie Williams with his bum out, and then Giselle in a Union Jack bikini. It was like peak Britpop. And I knew I fancied him and not her. And it was like a real choice, right?
Yeah.
It was like, there's a cover. I'm looking at Vogue, which probably tells you something in and of itself. And it was Robbie that I was attracted to. And at that point, I kind of knew. And And I was scared of it. I was scared about this idea of not, because you're told you're not able to be happy as a gay person. You're told you're going to get AIDS. Like at that age, when I was that age, that was the pervasive storyline, that's what happens. So I conflated this idea of like being who I was and loving clothes and, you know, all of this stuff that had been told was wrong when I was young, with suddenly this thing that was like, oh God, okay, that's why I'm different. And then it all seemed wrong, you know? It all seemed like it's this kind of, this negative that you should be veering away from. And in a way, it didn't really stop me. Like I carried on wanting to be a fashion designer. I wanted to be an artist. I kind of stayed in that world. But like I say, it kind of all percolated later into this realization that there had been this massive tension in my life and that I wasn't really feeling like I was able to be who I wanted to be.
Did you find a degree of positive representation? Were there any sort of role models or people that stood out to you at that time that were gay or that sort of helped you translate how you were feeling? Because what you were saying then about AIDS is, you know, if the majority of any kind of conversation about it is negative or inspires fear and puts you in a fearful place, that obviously is like a really difficult thing, particularly as a young man who's got all sorts of things in his head, let alone, you know, something so foundational as the very nature of who you are.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. And actually, weirdly, I haven't massively thought about it, but no, I didn't. You know, I actually really didn't. There were 10 other gay guys in my year when I was like 15. I was the last one to come out, and they were all quite camp and quite demonstrative. So we weren't really friends, and I probably distanced myself from them because I was nervous of being conflated at that time, which I feel kind of guilty about now, I guess.
You shouldn't.
No, but you know, you're a kid, aren't you? So you don't really know. But in terms of like adult role models, it's really difficult to think of any. It's really difficult because if you think the people that were on telly, for instance, at that time, it was Dale Winton, who was a bit of a laughing stock. He was a bit of a clown, you know, which is like my parents used to laugh when he was on screen, and it wasn't because of him being funny. It was because he was this kind of like court jester figure, really. And then you had Graham Norton, who kind of subverted it in his own way, which was smart and clever, but it lent into that kind of promiscuity, kind of naughtiness conversation, which I was kind of nervous of, obviously because of the AIDS fear. And then you had stories about people being outed, or which just again suggested that it isn't okay to be gay. You know, there were no actors really. There were no gay films that you could watch as like a young person. And you compare that to now, like there are so many like amazing, talented people who are gay and openly gay and in the public eye and speaking their truth about it. I'm speaking about this because I'm trying to think of someone, and I honestly cannot think of anyone. I can't think of anyone.
I mean, it's quite brutal to be honest with you, isn't it? To not have even a singular figure, right? To have someone to either help you listen to what they have to say about something, help you navigate the feelings that you're feeling. Because if someone has spoken about them before, right, you can go, "Oh my God, that's exactly how I feel," and you can take comfort in that, right? And interestingly, what you said about promiscuity, right? Because you mentioned in the book Attitude magazine, and the kind of I'm interested in exploring the sort of the spaces that were accessible, the places where you could find, you know, ways to explore the fact that you were gay, being places that were perhaps slightly more sexually provocative. And I wonder whether you think there's what the consequences of that are, or if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, in terms of discovering your sexuality as a young person, you know, in the days that I was in my teens, you know, it was the fledgling days of the internet. And as a consequence, like my parents didn't know how to manage it. And I kind of was learning quicker than they were because I had a young plastic brain at that point. And it meant that, you know, I was going on chat rooms and I was accessing things like Gaydar and fitlads.com or net or whatever. And it wasn't so much magazines because it was, you know, like MSN and those kind of sites started when I was about 14 or 15. So I had access to this world, which was suddenly there, but very, very, very underground. Like it was very seedy. Like people didn't have pictures. There's a real fear that you thought you were going to be outed. I had a couple of instances where I kind of was outed to people because I'd met up with someone from a school that my friend was at, and they'd told them, and it became this whole thing. And
I'm sorry.
by it being pushed down, and you're pushed underground, it becomes illicit.
Right.
It becomes something dirty and something wrong. And my own, I'm not embarrassed to say that my own relationship with sex has really been on a journey, because, when you are told that your desires and what your sexual experiences are dirty and wrong, it's very difficult to unlearn that. It's very difficult to go into then having a loving sexual relationship, which is about mutual respect and trust and openness and being open. And yeah, it has an impact. I mean, it was fun. Like, I was really young and I had access to this like secret world that my parents didn't know about. Put myself in some situations which were really risky in retrospect. But it was really good fun. Like, so I don't so much regret it. But I wasn't like my friends or peers who were able to have relationships at school, for instance, and try relationships on for size when they were 14, when they were 15. Didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
I didn't have my first serious relationship until I was like, I would say 22 probably. Wow. And that's actually quite early. Like, a lot of my gay friends didn't come out until that age. Right. I came out at 15. They didn't come out until that age. So then, you're at least 10 years behind everyone else. And I've certainly felt that. I feel like I've not found my footing with my own relationships until very recently. And that's what happens when you're held back by having to be clandestine.
Yeah, one of our previous guest, Maurice Gorham, the comedian, was previously a sex worker, and she talks about this. I mean, I will do it. I'm almost certainly going to sort of bastardize what she said, because she spoke about it very eloquently over the course of an hour. But she talked about how she really struggled to move from being a sex worker and actually enjoying the kind of the power dynamic, enjoying making money out of it, and almost feeling slightly guilty and ashamed for feeling that way, stopping sex work. And then she struggled to associate sex with kind of this being the thing that you do with someone that you love. And that previously it was just kind of a bit of a rush. Yeah. And now it only being a thing that you do with, people that you have emotions for. Not always, but most of the time. And struggling to transition. She quite struggled with that transition between those two things.
I'm sure. Just to be clear, I definitely did not do any sex.
Sorry, I wasn't implying it. No, I wasn't implying it. I wasn't implying it. I was just saying the themes. There's a common theme.
I totally hear what you're saying. Yeah. And it is that. It's like you're forced into the shadows.
There's a funny anecdote in the book. You were talking about the internet. Obviously, digital and the sort of the modern technology now is far removed from where it was back then. But back then, printers had quite a large role in how
this anecdote keeps coming up.
I'm sure. Well, for good reason, right? maybe it's best if I just sort of get out of the way and let you tell the story, perhaps.
So basically, I was using the computer. I think I was only about 14, and my dad had this like shrine of a big desktop computer in the study, which was next to the kitchen. And it was just enormous, and it had the dial-up modem, and the printer was equally enormous.
You still remember the noise of the dial-up?
Yeah, I'll try and do it. Yeah, had like a printer that was the size of the computer. It was like this iceberg. It took like an hour to print out a color page, and every time I would come home, my mum would usually she was studying to do a degree at that point, and my dad would be flying. He was a pilot. Often, so I would come home in the evening, and there wouldn't be anyone there, which was amazing. So I would go online and either go and chat to people, or I got either on MSN or otherwise, or I would look at porn. And this is, I was very young and it was very softcore, but still. And I had one incident where I would regularly print out pictures and save them and like fold them up and put them in this plastic fake book that was like a box that I'd been given by my parents for Christmas. You've got an example up there. That I'd been given by my parents for Christmas. So I'd hide these pages in the book thinking that no one would find them, despite the fact that my parents had given me the book as a present.
Feels like entrapment.
I mean, it's moronic is what it is on my part. So anyway, there was one evening I came back and printed out this specific picture, and I'd say, right, I want this colour because it's great. And the person looked like Abs from Five, who I was quite into at the time. Nice. my mum arrived home earlier than I'd anticipated, so I had to stop the printer halfway through, pull the page out, turn the computer off, leave it, run out. Later that night, we were having dinner, and my dad has come home from a trip. Earlier that morning, he was sleeping, he had jet lag, and he had his roster changed, and he was furious. He had to go onto the computer to check what flight he was going to be on the next day. So he goes in, logs on while I'm eating my peas, and suddenly I hear the printer jam into action. And this has happened before. The printer will pick up a job that it's been stopped halfway through. My mum had lost half her dissertation, and then half of it luckily had printed out. So I knew what was coming, and I just heard this sound. I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So I jumped up. My mum was like, finish your peas. So I ran out of the room, and I just heard my dad was like, fucking hell, Jane, what is that? In his Dutch accent. And my mum was just giggling. And they didn't speak to me about it. Like, I had some run-ins with my dad about the computer after that. Like, I'd looked at porn and he'd seen it, and my sister had seen certain things because I hadn't deleted the history or whatever. But we didn't run in about that. Nothing was said. And it was kind of weird. It went silent. I never saw the printout ever again. But it was easily one of the most mortifying moments of my young life, which is charted in its full extent in the book. If you care to read.
Sorry for making you relive it
for
the sake of content now.
Like, we all laugh. My dad laughs about it now, which is good.
I think most men have a story similar to that, where like they wise up pretty soon afterwards because their parents catch them the first time. It happened to me, and then you go, never again. I'm never having that fucking conversation again in my life.
Until the next time.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about how things move from perhaps that sort of what was unsaid in that moment, right? And then when you did come out to your mum and you did talk to her about how you felt and who you are. Sorry, I should say that. Could you tell me a little bit about that, your decision-making process, how you felt? Because obviously it's a ginormous thing to do, right? It's a really difficult thing to do. Yeah. And I can't really speak to it because I've never had to do it. So I'll sort of give the floor to you to talk about it, really.
I talk about this in the middle of the book in chapter 8. It's the Vivienne Westwood t-shirt. And basically I had been forcibly outed effectively at school. I had fallen in love with one of my best friends, and it was this like doomed, unrequited relationship. And I'd told someone about it at school, and she had swiftly told everyone. So not only was I outed as being gay, but I was also outed that I was in love with my best friend, who I spent all my waking hours with, and that relationship ended immediately. And the coming out process was expedited to such a degree that I was kind of like, well, I have to tell my mum. I have to tell my parents because my sister's going to hear about it at school and people are going to know. And the person I was most worried about hearing about it, weirdly, was my sister Romy, who was actually amazing and was great, but she'd heard it secondhand and struggled with that. But with my mum, I remember coming home. I've written about this in the book. I came home one night after it had happened, and it was just awful. Again, we were sitting in the kitchen having dinner, and I just couldn't stop crying. And I'd kind of gone to the toilet before dinner and kind of looked at a packet of paracetamol and thought, should I? In a slightly dramatic teenage way. And then she kind of could see I was in a state, and ushered my dad and sister out of the room. And I told her, and when I was writing this chapter of the book, I couldn't stop crying for literally for about 4 hours. It was very strange. And I hadn't really thought about it until writing it. I hadn't really revisited that moment. Wow. And doing so, it was like, oh my God, like for a young boy, really young boy, to have to experience that, to have to kind of run the risk of losing the person who's most important to you, having lost who you think is the most important person to you, which obviously turned out not to be. Yeah. But running the risk that your mum could say, well, no, you're disgusting and you're wrong and I don't want to have a relationship with you, which does happen and continues to happen around the world, and more often than not, probably. And she was extraordinary about it, and she suggested we go to Barcelona on a little mini break, and I bought a Vivienne Westwood t-shirt, which was this floral demonstration of my new found individualism and who I was. Well, it took me another 2 years to tell my dad. But yeah, it was a really, really hard thing to go through. And I was very fortunate. You know, I made a lot of new friends straight afterwards who turned out to be great friends and who I'm still very close to. So I lost nothing in the friendships that were lost in the process. It taught me a lot about trusting people with like things that are important to you. It taught me that my mum is an amazing person, that my family are amazing, and how lucky I am. And it allowed me to suddenly kind of feel like I could be who I was. But even though I told my mum, even though people knew, I still, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I still wore this idea of being straight acting or straight looking or straight behaving as this badge of honor. And I remember people saying to me, like my cousin's friends being like, "Oh, you're all right for one of them." I was like, "Oh, thank God, you know, I've passed." So despite having come out, despite having been, you know, exposed, I was still fearful of being who I was. And not that I am particularly camp necessarily in the traditional sense of the word, but I was still kind of hoping to pass. And again, that took another probably 20 years to get past and move beyond.
And I guess as well, an additional layer of complexity added by the fact that actually, when you revisit it, you realise that you didn't particularly have a great deal of agency, right, in the whole thing. You decided you were comfortable in yourself, ready to talk about it. It was like, I'm left with no choice.
Totally. But in a way, I'm almost slightly grateful because it pulled the bandage off.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it was like, it meant that I had to deal with it, and it meant that, you know, and I was, as I say, incredibly fortunate that my mum was as amazing as she was, and my family in general were. And it meant that I was then given the confidence to be open about it following that. If she hadn't been, I wouldn't have. And again, for a lot of people, that isn't the story that they have to tell. And I'm in awe of people, men, women, whoever, who are able to continue and be brave and live their truths and be who they are if they've been rejected or if they've not been accepted for that by the people that are meant to be closest to them.
Yeah.
So really, you know, like, mine isn't a sob story. I'm very, very lucky, and I'm very fortunate, and I recognize that fully. But that doesn't change the fact that the whole swathe of the population does not have to go through like the risk of losing everyone at early teenage years because of some quirk of biology, nurture, whatever it is. It just seems extraordinary to me, and I'm glad that things seem to be changing.
I think it speaks as well to the power of unconditional love, right? The capacity to be accepted regardless by your parents, and how transformative and important that can be, and equally, without that, the possible consequences for people, right? The fact that your mum accepted you made the situation better, right? Which was already a pretty fucking horrible one, right?
Yeah, totally. And that's an extraordinary thing. I mean, you know, it was slightly more difficult with my dad, as I think it tends to be. You know, it was really fine, but he was a bit like, "Oh, I need to think about this," when I told him. And I think it was just, you know, dads with their sons, it's always more complicated. We had quite a complicated relationship anyway. Like, he was away all the time because he was flying, and there was this kind of weird tension in our house because of that. But ultimately, he was and has been and continues to be amazing about it. So yeah, I feel very fortunate.
Would you be able to talk a little bit more about your relationship with your dad then? I mean,
yeah,
you described it as complicated there. I don't particularly want to put words in your mouth again, so would you be able to explore that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so my dad is effectively the antagonist in the book.
Great.
Like, he's the monster, but he isn't as well. He's a main character. He's the person with whom I have the most friction. And during my younger years, that was certainly true. Like, you know, he was this double-headed figure. He was this kind of mythical creature who was away flying in far-flung locales in Harare or in Tokyo. Or I was so proud of him, but I was also terrified of him. Like, you know, he'd come home from a trip and he'd be knackered, he'd be exhausted, be jet-lagged, and it was very difficult because we had built, me, my mum, my sister, had built this little club of three that did our thing, that saw the family, that, you know, rubbed along together, and then he'd come back and be this jet-laggy monster that would just disrupt that. And while that was hard for us, it must have been absolutely horrendous for him. And I didn't recognize that at all. And it's only, again, weirdly, writing this book, which is why it's been such extraordinary therapy, through writing it, I'd learned more about him. And I was able to analyze those things that I'd read at first as, that's just horrid, to actually, no, Dad was struggling, and he had a relationship with alcohol that, I don't know, maybe look back on now and would say it wasn't particularly healthy. But I think a lot of people did at that time.
Still do.
They still do. A lot of my family members did. Like we all kind of, I think, saw wine as some kind of medicine to some degree, and that didn't help. Like it would certainly make arguments more aggressive, and they would usually always be connected to alcohol. Particularly around birthdays and Christmases, they were always fraught. And my relationship with my dad kind of deteriorated until weirdly, until he split up with my mum when I was in my mid-20s. Like, so my late teens to mid-20s with my dad was tough. And I talk about that in the book. But then when he split up, my parents split up, I was suddenly forced to reconcile Dad on his own, as his own being, and to see the similarities between us, and to see him for who he was rather than through the prism of the family context. And he stopped drinking when he split up with my mum. And suddenly we rebuilt our relationship, and we have this amazing relationship now. I've stopped drinking. I stopped drinking 2 years ago.
Fair play.
Following a breakup. So kind of similar. And I don't think I could have done it had he not done it first. He's been a role model for me in many ways. And maybe he wasn't as much when I was younger. Maybe I didn't recognize him as that. And maybe I felt a bit kind of on my own. And as I've grown older, he has really become this kind of North Star of how I want to be. He's a proud, kind of self-possessed man who behaves well and is trustworthy. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what I want to be. And alcohol doesn't fit in that equation, particularly for he and I. But yeah, so it's been a real journey, and the book is all about that journey. And like I say, it was a real process of, like, I think I maybe started quite angry with him when I was writing it. I think I started feeling a bit like he hadn't taken any responsibility for anything, and we're in this situation. And actually, by the end of it, I was like, no, it's like we've all got our part to play. So it was a very public way of unraveling my thoughts and understanding of the experiences I had as a young person. So if anyone is struggling with that, I would recommend writing a book.
It's easy.
Because it really helps.
I honestly put such a smile on my face hearing you talk about your dad in those terms.
He's an amazing man.
Massively so. And talking about, we talk about the sort of divorce a little bit. As someone, I experienced it as well. I was year 5, so I was younger. And I was quite fortunate, I think, because of the age that I wasn't really conscious of either of my parents trying to sort of use me. I don't think they were doing this anyway, but even with hindsight, but like use me against the other, or try and, change my view of the other one. And I think they were quite good for doing that, to be honest with you. But even so, no matter what age you are, there's almost this, call it a pressure to almost pick a side, or to take a particular view on things. And you're just, even when I was sort of 12, 13 years old, you're kind of like, I'd actually rather just be, this is my life now, and I'll deal with it, and I'll deal with it however I see fit. I don't particularly want to have to, why is it up to me to decide where I am on a Tuesday night?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Totally. I mean, I can't imagine how hard that must be, to be honest. Like, my parents, my mum actively decided to keep it going for us. I think that whenever your parents split up, it's a strange thing, because you think you're going to be okay, particularly in your mid-20s, right? You're like, well, I don't need them anymore. Like, of course you do, but I'm not a kid. But there's still that, like, you have to split your time. You can't view them as a unit. You can't call the house and speak to both of them. You have to call them separately.
Completely.
And you are forced to take a side in some ways. I was definitely forced more to take a side when they were together, which was very destructive,
Yeah,
I
that's
think.
interesting.
And that's partly why my relationship with my dad was so difficult, because, as I say, he wasn't there as much. So naturally,
Yeah.
my mum was the right side, right? And in a way, them not being together enabled me to kind of be more objective.
So interesting.
Weirdly.
Yeah, so interesting to hear you say that about. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but you could sort of conceive of them as one thing when they're together, right? It's like my parents,
Yes.
and then they separate, and you're like, oh no, these are individual people,
Yeah.
which obviously they always have been, but
Yeah.
particularly I think from a younger age, right? You conceive of them as just authority, parents, that's it, and then you're like, oh my god, this is what my mum's like. Oh yeah, and you start to learn much more about. Well, I certainly did anyway.
I think there's something quite beautiful in that, in a way. I mean, it's desperately sad, and obviously you want your family to stay together, but like, it was all too easy, and that definitely happened when my parents were living together. It was all too easy to kind of like, Dad's not as easy on the phone, but so I'll call, I'll speak to Mum, and I've done it, so Dad knows that I've made the effort, but then maybe we just won't speak, and then you can go for months without speaking. Whereas now, like, being forced to have individual relationships, it means that you actually have individual relationships. There's no choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's been one positive out of a sea of negatives, but it's been a positive for sure, and one that I feel quite grateful for. Certainly with my dad. My dad's much older. Like, he's in his early 80s now, and he, I've been so happy that the last couple of years we've been so close. It's really important, I think.
Can we revisit what you were saying a couple of answers ago in relation to alcohol? Do you think your decision to stop drinking, and I know you also mentioned kind of the process of writing the book also changed the way you viewed your relationship with your father, and you touched on the fact that stopping consuming alcohol also probably had a bearing on it. To what extent do you think they were related? To what extent do you think not drinking changed, perhaps, I don't know, either your emotional picture or the way that you perceived your relations with other people? Could you talk about that in a bit more detail?
So how alcohol kind of changed my ability to emote? Yeah, I mean, it was really, it's weird, the booze thing, because I spent years just drinking.
Yeah.
It was so built into the culture of what I did for a job, aside from anything else. You know, like, you go on trips and you'd be given endless champagne. You'd fly business class, you'd get champagne. You'd land, you'd go to a dinner, you'd get it was constant, and it was every day. And then there was socializing, and then there was my family. And it was so built into the fabric of who I was that I couldn't even see an idea of a life beyond it. There was no option. It was like, how would life exist without this? It can't, so let's just keep going. And then I had a big crisis moment where the relationship I was in suddenly faltered, very sadly, at the time. And my job was suddenly strange after, COVID happened, obviously, and that was a big thing. My job was strange as a consequence, because suddenly writing about clothes when you're sitting on the sofa in your pants is a bit weird. And like many companies, Condé Nast had a bit of a shift. So there were lots of seismic changes, and I started moving house, and I was writing the book. And I was just like, what is the thing that is making all of this hard or harder? And it became abundantly clear that it was alcohol. Like, there was no escaping it. It was like, okay. And my therapist said the same thing. She was like, this is making it worse. And I credit to her for really helping me realize that too. And my dad, obviously, him having stopped on his own journey. But then I had an argument with a friend of mine, very close friend of mine. And I woke up the next morning and I couldn't remember why. I couldn't remember what it was about. I couldn't really gather my feelings about it because it had been so colored by the alcohol. I was like, okay, this is now palpably impacting. It had been impacting my relationships, but because it was so normal, it didn't even register. But that was a really obvious moment. So I went to an AA meeting in Camberwell, and I was sat in this like rainy, puffy face. I was like really hungover, rainy, kind of horrible back room of a church with all these very together, like marketing executives and people. It's like, this is not what I expected AA to be. And
Yeah.
well, everyone was really polished. And it was quite amazing because I was like, oh, okay, this is what life without it looks like. It kind of looks quite good. And there was someone who wanted to be my sponsor there, and they were like, if you don't stop, you're going to be injecting yourself with meth in 2 years and drinking Guinness in the morning. I was like, don't think that's necessarily true.
Quite strong.
But
yeah, nonetheless.
I take your point. So I didn't take on a sponsor. I didn't actually ever go back to AA, but that was my turning point. And I stopped on that day and then didn't drink since. And I suddenly realized, like, I looked at how I'd been in certain family situations. I was arguing with my sister constantly and not being particularly nice. I would argue with my mum constantly. And again, it was so normal. I would end up crying on friends at the end of big boozy nights. Normal. I've been doing it for 10 years. What's the difference? And then suddenly stopping and being like, oh God, not only do I have to confront my emotions because suddenly they're all there writ large, but actually it's manageable to do so because I'm not drinking, was a revelation. It was also, it's a weird thing because it doesn't make it any easier. Stopping drinking, sure, it kind of clears the decks and makes seeing things for what they are much more possible. You know, you can see your, one of the better term, demons, and kind of, it doesn't make it easier to confront them. You know, it doesn't make it easier to figure out how to actually deal with it. And not only that, but you have to deal with it. There's no hiding, you know. And that was, you know, 2 years today.
No way.
Today, not drinking.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.
Thanks. And it's been the most amazing, boring, revelatory, kind of unchanging thing. It's so odd. It's such an
I
odd
guess
thing.
part of it is, you know, you can't, if you want to, bizarre like military language, right? But if you can't take a shot at something unless you can see it straight, right? You know, you can't, you know, to be able to identify, you can't confront your demons until you can see them straight on. But I wonder as well, perhaps if there's, I often think about sort of people at uni, right? And how I spent my times at uni, which was putting all sorts into my body. And
Same.
yeah, and I wasn't the only one doing it. And how much of that is just, everyone says, yeah, well, you're just having a good time, aren't you? You know, you've got disposable income, you don't have any responsibilities, you're just out there having fun. And I wonder how true that is. I wonder whether it's, I don't know whether it's not something that's uniquely British, but is it a degree of escapism? Is it a degree of, you know, it's actually quite traumatic is probably the wrong word, but a time of change away from home, hours away from home for a lot of people, right? For the first time in their lives, uprooted and struggling to deal with it. And I wondered, I don't know if you necessarily have the same view, but like, I think there's something in there that's maybe or maybe isn't uniquely British. I don't know, but certainly that's how I got away from my problems. I think it was
Definitely.
substances, right?
Definitely. And you look back at it, you're like, of course, ultimate escapism.
Yeah.
And I think back, you know, to why I liked drinking so much. Like, what was that feeling? It's like you don't just get a high. Like, the high is connected to an emotion. It's like, for me, it was about liberation of emotion.
Right.
It was being able to share my feelings. That was the thing that was almost addictive, because it's like, I don't feel capable of doing that in a way that feels safe or allowed without it. And that was the thing that I was craving. That was the high that I was seeking. That was the out that I was searching for, which eventually ended up with me just crying all the time. And I think, I don't know if it is uniquely British. I do think we have an issue, men particularly, British men have an issue with expressing their emotions and managing their emotions. I certainly did. Like, I had no idea how to manage my emotions. And as a consequence, you mask them, you push them down, you hide them. And if you're going through something even more challenging than just living, like coming out or dealing with society not being happy with who you are, it compounds it, you know. And there are problems with addiction in the gay community, just as there are in the straight community. And it's so normalized. It's so laughed at. It's so like, oh, we know, silly person, like that's just what people do to cope. And like, even the fact that memes exist about normalizing, like everything normalizes that escapism. And it's so not normal.
Yeah.
It's so not normal.
It's
so damaging.
Completely, you know, what would you like to do with your pals? Well, we go and probably have about 6 pints on a Tuesday night, and I like doing it because for the first time, really, I can talk emotionally, you know, I talk openly about my emotions. And then if you actually stop and you go, okay, so that's how much at most you should be drinking in a week in the space of a few hours, and you're saying that's the only time you actually talk openly about how you feel, that's not good.
Unpack that.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And that thing about being allowed to talk openly about your emotions, it's like we don't get taught how to be emotional in the right way, I don't think. We don't get taught how to like understand and unpack how we're feeling and to actually be empathetic with one another. It's a really key skill. And you know, like if you want to be really mercenary about it, it's kind of important in business as well, like EQ. And we're just not taught how to do it. And the idea that you have to then give yourself like a 2-day hangover, which anyone under 30 is a thing after 6 pints, or a 3-day hangover for that matter, like, and you have to do that to get to that point. I mean, something's got to change. And it does feel like it is a bit. I have to say, like, the next generation, like in the magazine world, particularly in the fashion world, all of the younger guys who are coming up, they would look at the boozing behaviour of my generation and the generation above, and they'd be like, "What?
Yeah,
are you going out to dinner on a Tuesday night and getting absolutely hammered?
Yeah,
like,
what's going on?
Why?
Yeah,
like, you're not even with your friends. It doesn't register in the same way. So, you know, I think there is something shifting. Definitely, something has shifted in terms of the Gen Z relationship with alcohol.
Did it change your conception of sort of who you were as a man by stopping drinking? And I'm going out on a limb, but previously you'd mentioned, right, about having this armor, straight armor, right? And I'm not saying that you still have those things, or maybe you do. I again leave it up to you. But certainly I know when I was younger, particularly within my male friendship circle, you know, drinking and being able to drink a lot that's like a badge of honor, right? That's like very foundational to particularly sort of teenage boys. They're how they sort of relate to each other and rank themselves amongst each other. I'm not saying that, you know, as a grown man you still sort of indulged in those things, but I wonder the consequences for your, you know, how you identify as a man stopping doing that, whether it had any bearing on that.
That's a weird thing, and I hadn't really thought about it. It's a good question, because I actually think it lent into those traditional masculine tropes more, because in a way, at the beginning, I was competitive with myself. Yeah, really competitive. It was like, well, if you let the side down now, you're a fucking failure. Like, you cannot think about drinking, and that was the real like reason at the beginning. I was like craving that. Like I was keeping tally on this app of every day that I'd not drunk. So it was that kind of competitive. It was a little bit self-flagellatory as well. It was a little bit like, you know, you're not good if you start again, you're worthless if you start again. And there was also that idea, like I said, about wanting to feel proud of myself. I wanted to feel like this kind of pillar. And since I've stopped drinking, I've almost replaced the time spent doing that, not with relaxing, but with challenging myself constantly, like learning to paint again, like running, like I bought a piano, so I'm like playing the piano all the time. I'm writing more, and it's like push, and there is something about this idea of being like a male provider figure, pillar in the world that has become more prevalent through stopping drinking, which is weird, and it worries me a bit actually. And I speak to my therapist a little bit about it, because it's like, I would just like to be able to just be chilled. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And alcohol did do that. Like, I have to say, one of the biggest things I miss is the enforced, like, slobbishness of a hangover.
Yeah.
Where you're like,
got an excuse.
It's fine.
Yeah.
I can just lie around in my tracksuit all day.
Takeaway.
And watch TV and eat takeaway. That does not happen now. Ever. And I miss that a little bit.
Yeah, you always will. So it's funny, isn't it? Some people say, "Oh yeah, I miss after a hard day's work that first pint. I'll never get that back." And I've spoken to other people who are sober now, and they say that, or the lovely bottle of wine. And it's interesting to be like, you know what? Actually, I miss the hangovers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't miss like the crushing anxiety and like that feeling of going on to work in the morning crying to listening to Fix You on the bus. Like all saggy faced and grey. I don't miss that. But the Sunday where you're still a little bit drunk and you're lying on, you know, in your filth, like there's something lovely about that.
I think it'd be for sure there is, mate. Sure. I think I'd miss the Bloody Marys. Teo, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much, Ollie.
I've loved talking to you.
Yeah, love talking to you too.
Cheers.
Thank you. It's been brilliant.